Okay. Good evening, everyone. My name is Richard Rothis. I am the Dean of the College of Liberal Arts and Social Sciences at Central Michigan University, and welcome to this evening's event for the Clarke Historical Library. It's always a little disorienting speaking into a monitor and not being able to see the wonderful audience, but I can see the audience list, so it's great to know that people are out there. So I'm glad to have you with us this evening. We have a spectacular guest this evening, so I'm not going to say very much except to do an introduction and get us going. With us tonight is Rachel Williams. Rachel Williams is this is a hard introduction to get through quickly. So Rachel Marie Crane Williams is an artist and teacher currently employed as an associate professor at the University of Iowa and also a university ombuds. I can't read through the whole introduction because it'll take us forever. Rachel has a joint appointment in the School of Art and Art History and Gender, Women's and Sexuality Studies. I'm sure that interest will come out in the presentation tonight. I don't know that for sure, but I'm guessing, and I'm seeing a head nod, so I think I was right. Originally from North Carolina, but now living in Iowa since 1998. And working as a researcher and a creative scholar. On days when I'm not wearing the suit and being a dean, I'm a historian. I will vouch for your credit, for your skills as a historian. Absolutely, you're a spectacular archivist and historian. And I'm jealous because you're also an artist. Rachel also has an endless list of other amazing skills, a doula, Lamaze, rape victim advocate, Inside Out, worked inside educating people in the prisons, working as a university ombuds, one of the most challenging jobs there is at a university, worked in community colleges as well, and also an author. And I have to find the relevant books. I moved off camera, bad form, but I had to do it to get the books. Tonight, we will be hearing about Run Home If You Don't Want to Be Killed, the Detroit Uprising of 1943, which you definitely should get a copy of at your local bookstore. If you don't have a local bookstore, may I recommend The Source in Detroit, which will send you a copy. So I believe they are, I had the window open, but I closed it. I think it's sourcebooksellers.org. I'm also going to recommend another book that Rachel has done, which is a little bit different, Elegy for Mary Turner, which is an illustrated account of a lynching. It's similarly historic, but is amazing in a different sort of way. I don't know if we're going to hear about it tonight, but I'm going to plug it anyways. And then if you go to rachelwilliams.squarespace.com, there's a whole variety of other work that you can enjoy or download at your leisure. It's all wonderful, but I think that's enough of an introduction. And Rachel, I'm going to turn it over to you and take it away. We will have questions at the end. We're going to ask you to put your questions into the chat box, so save them up. If you're afraid you're going to forget your question, go ahead and put it in the chat box as we're going. I will keep track of them, so don't be shy.
Dean Rothis, thank you so much for that introduction. I really, really appreciate it. And again, plug the Source Bookstore. It's a wonderful place, and I'm really tickled to be here tonight. So I have a presentation, and Central Michigan has been incredibly patient with my lack of technology. So thank you. So I'm the department chair of the Department of Gender, Women's and Sexuality Studies, and I'm also in the School of Art and Art History and in the Painting and Drawing program. And I'm really thrilled to be here tonight from Iowa City. Let's see, so if we go to the next slide. And I want to say yay for libraries. The other thing I would say is that if you can't get the book, go to your library, your local library, and ask them to buy it and then check it out when it comes in. So, and I believe they can also get e-copies too. So I am thrilled to be speaking to you from a library, and I really think libraries are some of the greatest places on earth. I grew up in a very rural part of Eastern North Carolina, and if it had not been for libraries, I would have been a very bored or mischievous child. So I am super thankful to have libraries. And I have to say, libraries played a huge role in the culmination of this project. Without librarians, archivists, and libraries and archives, I never could have done any of this. So great. So I'm going to talk a little bit. I'm going to start off by talking a little bit about my own inspirations, and then I'll move into how, what this book is about and how I came to do it. So I'm coming to you from my studio. I know it looks terrifying, but I do want you to know I am a working artist. And so the things that really inspire me and actually inspired this book were stories, social issues, narrative and illustrative modes of storytelling, and history. All of those things sort of came together in this project, and I'll talk a little bit about each one of those things. So I want to share a quote with you. So Susie Gablick is one of my favorite writers and artists, and she says, vision is not defined by the disembodied I, as we have been trained to believe. Vision is a social practice that is rooted in the whole being. So I share this quote only to say that as an artist, one of the things that I think is really important is to think about the power of images and how those images are visceral, and you can literally sometimes feel them in your body, but also in your own experiences. And one of the things that really got me very excited about this particular project were the experiences of people who were willing to come forward and share their stories of the experience of living through the unrest in Detroit in 1943. And many of those stories came out of the NAACP archive. So I'll talk a little bit more about that. So I wanted to share with you sort of the way I think. This is one of my notebooks. And so, when I'm in meetings or when I'm talking to people or when I'm thinking about things, this is how I take notes. So I've always drawn and sketched and thought about, how do stories, words, and images come together? And the thing that's really interesting about comics is that comics involve images, they involve text and texts. They involve a story because they're sequential, and then they also involve time. So, you have two panels in a comic, and the space between those panels is called the gutter. And if you think about music, it's like a rest. So it's a beat. So time happens, and your brain does this amazing thing where it pulls those two pictures together and makes a story. So, I've always sort of woven all of those things together in just my daily practice. So this is from one of my notebooks. You'll go to the next slide. This is another sort of image, and this was from a panel discussion. But, this is how I think. And I share this with you also to say, if you talk to a historian, a real historian, this is not at all how they think. They're incredibly organized, and they have this amazing way of stitching a lot of disparate events together, a lot of facets of how something has unfolded to make a story. So I do want to say too that I really stood on the shoulders of giants to do this project, and I don't think or keep track of notes or archive things at all like a historian. So it was really, really a struggle. So if you'll go to the next slide. And I did want to show you my paintings. One of the things people have said about this book is I did not grow up reading comics. I did not grow up drawing comics in the typical way that sort of, you know, people are used to sort of seeing comics with superheroes and exaggerated bodies and, you know, a lot of very particular ways of thinking about the page. And so I really approach this more like an artist. So I always want to say to people, when you look at this book, it's sort of like an artist's interpretation of a story using elements that comic artists use. So if you can just flip through these paintings, these are fairly large. They're mostly in watercolor. And they're, you know, this is an older piece, but this is really about Western Asia and sort of how we've invaded or did invade that space. Of course, now we've withdrawn. So go to the next one. And a lot of my work, and just keep flipping, it's totally fine. A lot of my work is sort of diaristic. So it's really about things happening in my life, you know, what's going on. The other thing is that I love to sit outside and paint. That's sort of my, you know, real soul place, the place that I am most happy. And that really has to do with place. And that is another thing that really drew me to the story of what happened in Detroit. Detroit is an amazing place. It is just deep, you know, in layers of history. And that city has an incredible soul. So let me tell you a little bit about the impact of what happened in 1943. So I found this story. I went to lunch with a friend and I had just finished a piece about the Wilmington Massacre in 1898 and how, you know, when you talk about stealing an election, that's a perfect example. And there was really a coup and a number of people fled North Carolina after that, especially people who were Black or white politicians who did not agree with the white Democrats at that point in time. So I just finished that story and, you know, done a lot of research about it and worked closely with Tim Tyson, who partnered with David Soselsky to write that story. And my friend said, you know, if you are interested in those kinds of stories, you should take a hard look at Detroit. And I said, in 1967. And he said, no, you should look at 1943. And I said, what happened in 1943? Because in my mind, in 1943, we have the war. Obviously, Jim Crow South is alive and well, but I had no idea. You know, I knew about the Zoot Suit riots in LA. I knew there was a disturbance in Harlem, but I had no idea the scale of the disturbance that happened in Detroit, the uprising. So as a result of those few days in June in 1943, 34 people were killed, 25 were Black and 9 were white. 17 Black people were fatally shot by police. 675 people were injured. 2,000 people were arrested and detained by police. Many of those were Black. $2 million in property damage occurred. And there were, I mean, hours and hours and hours of labor lost as a result of this, because it was a tremendous disturbance across the city. And this panel, I wanted to share with you this panel. So one of the things I did, and again, this is sort of thinking more like an artist than a comic book illustrator. On one side of this panel, you'll see a list of names taken from a newspaper, and those are people, you know, that died. And then I really worked with this idea of the hash marks to sort of talk about, you know, how those people, there were so many people that were injured, so many people that didn't show up in statistics. And we'll talk a little bit about that. You know, a lot of that has to do with gender. So in the next slide, you would see a picture of many of people up and down Woodward Avenue. And it's a large crowd of people. This is taken from an image from the Detroit Free Press. And if you look at that image, as soon as we can get it pulled up, what you would see is a large crowd. And you would notice that the gender diversity of that crowd, you know, you would notice there's people who identify as men as well as people who identify as women. And they're running, you know, in this direction. Where they're going, I believe they're headed towards a streetcar and a disturbance that's happening on a streetcar. One of the things that's interesting about this image, if you can imagine it in your head, is that it tells a particular story, but that story is not the same story that was necessarily told by folks right after the riot. And certainly a lot of the statistics don't really tell that story. So there was a lot of writing done directly after the uprising in 1943 by sociologists, white men, and also by people trying to figure out, how did this happen? And they really ignore the presence of women, and they ignore the experiences of Black women in particular. So let me talk a little bit about the issues that led up to the riot. So in 1943, you've got the city of Detroit. It's experienced the Great Migration. There are housing shortages. So you had a lot of people coming from the South to Detroit with the promise of jobs. And what happened was there was about 60 square blocks in Detroit where people who were Black could find housing, but they really did have a very difficult time outside of that area, Paradise Valley, Black Bottom, finding places to live. So you have, more and more overcrowding. And in 1942, there was an effort made to create housing for defense workers who were Black, and that led to another sort of disturbance around the Sojourner Truth Housing Project. Even the name of that was contested for a while. And the people that protested the fact that these houses were built for African-American workers were Polish, white Polish residents of Detroit, and middle-class Black residents of Detroit who lived in Conant Gardens. And many of the people that protested that development were women and their children. So they would these white Polish women would show up and picket where the housing was being built. So housing shortage was a problem. The other thing that was a problem, there were contested spaces. So where could people recreate? Where could people be, especially young people? And, there was a real sort of geographic struggle over what spaces were common spaces in Detroit. And Belle Isle is one of those spaces we'll talk about that plays a very prominent role in the uprising in Detroit in 1943. The other thing you have going on, which I mentioned before, is the Jim Crow South. You have Jim Crow happening and a lot of discrimination all across the country. At the same time, we are at war fighting against that, fighting for human rights. And so really the United States at that point in time is talking out both sides of its mouth. So Black people came up with this amazing campaign called the WWII for Victory campaign that basically said victory abroad and victory at home. And victory at home looked like having, a country where everyone's civil rights were respected. The other thing that happens in Detroit is it becomes the arsenal of democracy. So a lot of factories very quickly retool to make war machines to sort of help with the defense effort. And as a result of that, and prior to that, you'd had this building system of labor unrest where labor unions were really working hard to be recognized as a force, as a voice for workers. And there was a lot of divisiveness around race and who could be in the labor union and who couldn't, and where the labor unions could be and what their boundaries were in terms of negotiating with people like Ford. And in the book, I focus specifically on the Ford Motor Company just because it made for a really interesting case study. But this unrest related to labor, related to working conditions, related to who can get jobs, how they work, what work is like, happened all across those factories that had been retooled. But I do focus specifically on the Ford Motor Company and the history of Henry Ford, which is fascinating. The other thing you see is this ongoing, brutality in the Ford Motor Company, and sort of in particular with Harry Bennett Ford's service department, which was, I think, the largest private security force in the country at that point in time. And Harry Bennett is a really interesting character. I would love for someone to do a graphic narrative about Harry Bennett. He was a boxer. He really worked hard to build up the service department, and he hired people who were really brutal and fairly cruel, and who resorted to sort of physical violence and intimidation to sort of keep workers in line. The other thing is, for folks who know a little bit about the Ford Motor Company, is there's a very complicated history with the Black community. You know, on one hand, Henry Ford felt as though it was his duty to help Black people. On the other hand, that sense of duty was coming from a long history of sort of a white supremacist savior complex. Okay, so let's see, we're still working on this. So the next slide you would see would be some images. So I'll tell you a little bit about how I worked on the images. This book took me 13 years to write and to draw. And I started off, when I started this book, and I'll show you some images from when I first began drawing. This would be an image from that period of time. I was working strictly with paper and pens, you know, and I did put things into Photoshop so that I could, you know, play around with text, but it was really a very laborious experience where I was really drawing these images. And over time, you know, I did use a Wacom tablet, but over time, the technology kind of caught up to my aesthetic. So towards the end of the book, I was able to begin drawing on an iPad. So this, for example, these are drawings that are done on an iPad. So one of the things for me that's really interesting about this book as an artist is just sort of how it archived my process and my language as an artist. So one of the first stories I'll talk about is the Battle of the Overpass. And this is a really well-known story, well-documented. You know, obviously there was that very famous series of newspaper photographs that were taken as Walter Reuther's getting, you know, the crap beat out of him, literally. But I try to tell this sort of different story about the women of the UAW and how they also participated in this. You know, they loaded up, they wore green berets, they went down to pass out flyers and to sort of stand in solidarity with the men who were there. And there is this wonderful story that I read about, and I sort of build it up where this woman is talking to her husband about, you know, it's going to be fine. The night before she goes down there, and lo and behold, it's not fine. You know, one of her comrades gets off the bus. She's punched in the nose. You know, it's this experience that really isn't talked about, that women were there too and present. And I share this because creating that particular smaller story really required me to think about how to do history in a comic book form. And I realized initially when I began, and I just focused strictly on, you know, real people, real things that were said. You know, I was very careful about, like, if there's a real person in this book and something comes out of their mouth, it's a quote. But I was left with very big holes in the story. And my friend Corey Creekmer, who's a comics scholar, said, "Rachel, thank you. This looks wonderful." He said, "It's a comic. You can tell stories." So then I began to use historical research and archives to create sort of imaginary stories, you know, where I tried to imagine what was it like for the people who were there. So, for example, this is the main character in that story of the Battle of the Overpass, and she's a composite person based on you know, the accounts of a number of women who are there. So within the book, it's really a mix of, you know, historical people with, you know, very real events and stories mixed in with composite, what I would like to think about as composite history. So if you go to the next slide, I can talk a little bit about that as well. And that was really the experience of Black women during World War II. And there are some phenomenal scholars who have looked closely at this. This was a story that I found about a woman who was a Black nurse who enlisted, and she was sent to Australia. And when she got there, you know, a number of the people she was serving with, especially men that she helped, had never, you know, seen a Black woman or been cared for by a Black woman. And they sort of said terrible things to her, you know, asked her if she had a tail, really awful sort of treatment. And here's this woman trying to help them. So, you know, I took that story and imagined these two women in Detroit in a kitchen washing dishes, talking about they really wanted to be, you know, part of the war effort. They really wanted to participate, and that no one was really allowing them to do that because they were Black women. See if you can go to the next slide. Perfect. Another group of women that I got really interested in was the Detroit Housewives League. And these women, these Black women, were really pushing to support the Black economy in Detroit. And prior to 1943, they had been involved in sort of a movement to have people buy food, produce, goods from Black-owned businesses, and they were pretty radical. In fact, there's one story where they burned down a warehouse. So if you can imagine these women, when you see photographs of the Detroit Housewives League, these women are dressed beautifully. They have hats, they have purses, they are sitting, you know, in these lovely rooms. You know, they look like, you know, the junior league, and then, but they're doing this radical work. So that really gave me, that story gave me this opportunity to have them come together and talk about, you know, their sort of, their push with labor and how to think about, you know, their partners and themselves being accepted as a valid part of the workforce. They also introduced some characters who were really primary in that moment. Okay, so if you can go to the next one. Y'all are so patient with my technology tonight. I really appreciate it. So those are some stories that are, you know, taken and composed. This story, if you look at this panel where you see women with the thought bubbles and the speech bubbles coming out of their mouths, those are based on real stories. So these are two women. One is a sister and one is a mother. Their brother and son were arrested on Belle Isle, and they didn't know what had happened. They had no idea that all of this civil unrest is happening and that there's violence, and their family doesn't come home, and they get really worried, you know, what happened. So it ends up both of these women basically go from police station to police station in Detroit. They're ignored. No one helps them. Eventually they find their family members, but their stories were part of the NAACP archive, which really is the thing that sparked me to write this book. The NAACP came to Detroit right at the very end of, in June, at the very end of all of the disturbances and the uprisings and the unrest, and took people's affidavits because they knew there was an incredible amount of police brutality sort of tied to what was happening, that the police really were inadequate in terms of being responders. This other image over here are white women, and these are two Polish white women talking about, you know, returning to Belle Isle after, you know, after everything is settled down, after the state police and the National Guard and soldiers have left Detroit, you know, and what their feelings were about what had happened. So there's a couple of panels where they're hanging out laundry. And one of the things I love about this, and actually all of these women doing this book was really interesting as an artist, because I had to go back and think about, what did people wear in 1942 and 1943? What did patterns look like? What did buttons look like? What were hats like? What were shoes like? And that was actually a really fun and wonderful experience. And one of the things that was a wonderful archive for me were actually photographs of my grandmother, who was a young woman in 1943. That, and then she made all these quilts out of her father's and brother's work shirts. So I had these quilts with these wonderful patterns from that time period. So I was able to scan those and then insert them. So you can see the woman, the second woman who has the pearls and the hat and the glasses, and that jacket is a scanned copy of a pattern that's taken from that quilt. Okay, so if we'll switch to the next slide. Again, police brutality is a major feature of this book. And I started this 13 years ago. I hope that tells you that police brutality has been an ongoing problem in our country for decades. It's not new. despite many people sort of waking up to this after the murder of George Floyd. But you know, it's interesting that my book happened to come out in 2021, shortly after all of those things happened in the summer of 2020. So, and then I also do a lot of these double images. One of the other chapters in the book is sort of about how rumors circulate when there are these communal disturbances, and how those rumors in the white community look one way and in the Black community they look another way. And that is how I sort of came upon the story of Mary Turner, which spurred this book. And this is one reason this book took me 13 years to do, because in the middle I decided to write a second book. Never do that. But one of the rumors that circulates is that a Black woman is killed along with her child. And, you know, the rumor was that she was thrown off the bridge. And so there's a long history of that particular trope running through Black communities, whereas in the white communities, there's a trope that a white woman was assaulted by a Black man, and that also circulated. If you can go to the next slide. And this is another sort of example. One of the things that was interesting and a challenge about this project is to sort of make people from the 1940s who were really key players in this come to life. And so Mayor Edward Jeffreys, you know, plays a big role in this comic book. And he actually was a really liberal politician, a very kind man. In this, I had to bend him just a little bit to sort of make the point that he was, you know, really in denial that things were going to go, you know, blow up in Detroit, and that he sort of became ineffective in his panic. You know, he wasn't really sure what to do and what the stakes were. So I talk a little bit about him, but again, you know, I had to imagine, you know, what his life was like. So I spent a lot of time in the Detroit library, public library, reading his letters, and letters that were sent to him around the time of the uprising. So I imagined him laying in bed at night and thinking, what am I going to do, you know, while his wife slept peacefully next to him. So if you want to go to the next slide. This is another image from the chapter about rumors, and here you can see the Black woman and her baby. You can see the white woman, and soldiers figured prominently also into the disturbance, especially at Belle Isle. There was a lot of fighting between Black youths and white soldiers. And then this is an image from Belle Isle, and I love this image, and it was really fun to do because, you know, obviously I was able to go back to these patterns, but I was also inspired by a number of things. One of those was the poetry of Jim Daniels, and I think he did a beautiful job of capturing, you know, the spirit of Detroit. So I did read a lot of poems and poetry by a lot of people. I also, I was just looking to see if I had my book by Herb Boyd, Black Detroit. So there was a lot of things that went into imagining Belle Isle. And I also went to visit Belle Isle and spend the day there, and it was just a beautiful place to be. And I was trying to imagine, you know, what's a picnic like? Like everyone goes to Belle Isle that Sunday and they don't think anything bad is going to happen. And they're eating chicken and boiled eggs, and, you know, lo and behold, the evening unfolds and things really get out of control. All right, so if you'll go to the next slide. So the other thing about this book is I really do talk about the influences. Here's Belle Isle, and you can see a picture from the newspaper that's a soldier. And then this is the bridge that goes over Belle Isle. And there was a wonderful poem about the bridge at Belle Isle written sort of to commemorate the dedication of that bridge. But I also love the history of Belle Isle, that originally it started off, you know, the story is there were pigs put out there to eat the rattlesnakes. And I won't pronounce it in French because I have a very thick North Carolina accent and my French is horrendous. But there was a lot of tension before the events of June 20th. And, you know, they were wound up, people were really wound up, especially white people, by sort of media. So this is Father Coughlin. He would come on the radio and really spew hatred, you know, and white supremacy. And so that did not help with racial tensions in Detroit. If you want to move. So June 20th is when things really blew up. So one of the things I really wanted to get in my book was a sense of place. Again, I think Detroit is a magical city. A lot of what was there in 1943 obviously is not there anymore because of urban renewal and because the way, you know, highways came in and neighborhoods changed and were, you know, destroyed. And so I did do a lot of riding around, looking, taking pictures of houses, trying to map out, you know, where things would have been, even though they are no longer there. If you can go to the next slide. And then I really ended it again. I was inspired by a poet. Philip Levine writes this beautiful poem about Belle Isle, and that's sort of how I wanted to end it. And I actually was able to correspond with him before he passed away and say, you know, can I use your poem? And he was super generous, said, of course you can, I would love that. And then, you know, later on, before the book could be published, he passed away. But this is another sort of, you know, view from Belle Isle, and his poem that was inspired. These images is called Belle Isle. So that I would urge everyone to go there and spend a day and then go back at night and look around if you can. It's just beautiful. All right, if you can go to the next slide. The other thing I was really fortunate, and again, you know, I hope you understand all of this is on the shoulders of giants. Emily Koodle, who is an not archaeology, sorry, I was thinking of Dean Rothfuss, who is an architecture professor, did this amazing project where she took photographs, old photographs that were archival of Black Bottom and put them together to sort of recreate the neighborhood. And that was, you know, this is where a lot of the uprising happened. And that was incredibly helpful for me to really get a sense of place. So I just thought I would show you, you know, here is the photograph and then here's my drawing of that. And this is one of those things, I am not good at drawing cars. And so choosing to do a book about Detroit, you know, in the age when they were making beautiful cars, and they've always made beautiful cars, was really a challenge and really intimidating for me as an artist. So if you're a car person and you're good at drawing cars, my book might drive you a little crazy because I'm not good at drawing cars and I struggled to draw cars. Did a lot of research to figure out, you know, how to make cars look specifically like the make and model that they were. But her work was incredibly helpful to me as an artist to kind of be able to piece together, you know, what things look like. If you want to go to the next slide. And I just wanted to show some pictures of Detroit just so you could get a sense of place. You know, it's always been a metropolis. It's always been bustling. It's always been really a very diverse area. So if you'll go to the next one. This is Hastings Street. There was a lot of violence on Hastings Street around during this period of time. And go to the next one. And then this is 8 Mile, the 8 Mile Wall. And so one of the things I also talk about, you know, obviously I talk about the housing shortage, but also how redlining affected things. And you can still see the effects on the city and geography of Detroit today. And so, you know, we still have some of those same issues happening where we do have housing shortages. There's still police brutality. There are still contested social spaces. So if you'll flip the slide again. And then I really spent a lot of time in the archives, and I sort of wanted to do a shout out to sort of my favorite ones. So the Walter Reuther Labor Archives at Wayne State University, which is a fantastic school, as well as Central Michigan. I spent a lot of time in the labor archives there, and that was where I first found the NAACP papers, and, you know, a number of phenomenal artifacts. This is this picture with the beautiful murals in the background is the Detroit Public Library, and I spent a lot of time there going through the papers of Mayor Jeffries. The picture that has the purple stripes at the bottom is at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, their archives, and then you'll see the very architecturally unique Charles Wright Museum, which is an African-American history museum, incredible place to go visit. And then this is the Detroit Free Press, which they were incredibly kind. I went there one day and said, I'm just wondering if you have photographs from 1943 and the uprising. And they said, absolutely. This wonderful woman who was in charge of sort of the history of photographs there let me back into the archives and said, open this file drawer, and pulled out, manila folders filled with marked up photographs that hadn't been used by the newspaper. And that was incredibly helpful, piecing together how things looked. All right, if you'll go to the next one. So I also used a lot of primary documents. So these are just a couple of images. The one on the where it says what caused the Detroit riot is a report that came out from the NAACP afterwards. And of course, newspapers all over the country featured Detroit and what had happened with the uprising. And I really prefer to use the word uprising because riot really makes it seem like there was no reason people just sort of were violent and things just happened, but they really did have a reason. There was this fear of losing ground or never being able to gain ground. So I think Black and white communities in Detroit that were involved in the uprising had very different reasons to be in the streets, but they felt they both had adequate reasons. The Black community was tired of being denied places to live, tired of being denied, the full privileges of citizenship, and white people in Detroit, especially new white people in Detroit, and as well as some established residents of Detroit, felt as though they were going to lose their privileges. They were going to lose things they had worked really hard to build up, and wanted to keep those spaces white. And so people really felt compelled to participate in what happened in 1943. If you can go to the next one. And here's another newspaper that has images. The images were really crucial, the photographs, just so that I could get a sense of the scale, the violence, what was happening and who was there and what they looked like, what age people were, what they might have had in their hands, their body language. All of that was really crucial in terms of writing and drawing this book. You want to go to the next one? And again, I just want to mention that this is just a slice of my bookshelf. During this project, I have a giant box of books that I'm going to send to Christine Peel of the Detroit Public Library that sort of I amassed as a result of this project. And again, a lot of writing was done in 1944 and 45 by sociologists and journalists and people trying to figure out what happened. It was from a very white male perspective. There was another sort of interest happened again about the uprising after 1967. People went back and said, what happened in 1943? How is that being echoed? And what happened in 1967? And then the thing about Detroit is it also follows some similar paths of other, urban rebellions across the country. So for example, I've got this book about Tulsa in 1921 here. And there are interesting features where entire communities are just annihilated. And that was also true in the Black community. There was a lot of just pure annihilation as a result of this unrest. Okay, if you can go to the next slide, you'll also see Faith in the City in that, which is a great book by Angela Dillard. So I had all of this information. I had primary documents, I had photographs, I had the writings of other historians, and then how did I translate that into a comic book? So this is, again, you can see my notebook. So if you look at that first page, you'll see kind of this speech bubble. So I really had to break it out into what was going to be said, what was going to be narrated, what was the chronology of the images, what did I have to include, and what could I leave out and let people sort of put it together. So building that chronology, of the days across the city was actually really difficult. And where did city leaders insert themselves? Where were meetings? There were a lot of meetings at the YMCA. There were meetings at City Hall. There were meetings with police commissioners, what's happening. And so trying to pull all those views together to make a whole picture. So this is what my notebook looks like. And I show this to my friends that are historians and they are horrified. They're like, how did you figure out what you were even doing? If you can go to the next slide. And then this is what my desk like most of the time I was working. So again, it was really a mix. I did work with really simple tools. In this drawing, you can see some of my drawings by hand. You can see an affidavit, a letter that someone wrote for the NAACP, and, obviously, a book and a photograph that was straight from the Detroit Free Press. You can still, if you look closely, see the markings where the photographer planned to crop it. So if you can go to the next one. And this is just another sort of putting this series of drawings together. This is about a shooting, a police shooting, and the victim that was shot laid on the floor for a very long time. And police, before they left, they were like, is he dead yet? They were very, very callous towards this person. All right, if you can go to the next slide. And I just shared this slide because on top of that is my father's Bible, which is this sort of thick book. And then this is a stack of drawings. So I have this huge stack of drawings that I did. I'm not really sure what to do with them. Part of me is like, I could burn them, but I have, I probably did about 300, 350 of these drawings for this book. So it was a very labor intensive process as an artist. And if you'll go to the next slide. And there's the book. So if you're interested, I kind of glossed over it. I think it's 275 pages long altogether, and a lot of that has to do with sort of the last little bit really is about who's who in the book. I tried to sort of make a thing where you could figure out who each person is and what their history is, and then really documenting, there's footnotes so you can really follow my trail, which is pretty fun. But I hope you like it. I hope you'll buy it. I hope you'll think about reading it and think about all of the history in Detroit, and think about, what's changed and what hasn't in terms of the political landscape of our country. And I think I've got one more slide. And yeah, so we could just go back one and you could leave it on the cover. And then if people want to ask me questions, that would be great. And I know I've talked a lot, so you might be just overwhelmed and tired.
Do remember, we are monitoring the chat for questions, not the Q&A box. So put those questions in the chat. Rachel, while people are warming up with their questions, I'm going to ask you one.
Sure.
We have right next door, in a building next door, actually, Angeline Bully is here talking about Firekeepers Daughter, the #1 New York Times young adult bestseller. She was here last night talking about how she wrote that book, 10 years.
Wow.
She's faster than you. But then it's not illustrated, so maybe that's the difference. On the other hand, it's longer, so I mean, you're kind of slow. But it's a young adult novel. She was talking a lot about the structure, the hero's journey, and actually before, well, in my transition between meetings and coming here, I was trying to think, well, who's my favorite character in Run Home? And then I realized I don't really have a favorite character, because you don't really have a story arc with characters. I do have a favorite character, Thompson, double V for victory. I'm a little obsessed. I'm driving my family crazy with that, but that's an obsession.
Yeah.
So was that intentional, that there isn't a story arc like that, or is that personality, how you write? Or can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. I really struggled, because once I had my arms around what had happened, and, really the thing with the uprising is it's a bunch of small stories, between people in this moment, and they kind of become stitched together into this bigger sort of social occurrence. So I really didn't feel like I could write a story arc. I mean, I did think at one point about saying, okay, I can make an imaginary character and trace that character's journey through the violence, but I also couldn't figure out how to really share some of the really significant moments in that. And it's also, you know, when I put it together and looked at it, it really was a series of small stories. And I really wanted to focus on the social issues. You know, I was really trying to think about it like a historian instead of kind of a fiction writer. But I think it would make a wonderful, you know, a wonderful piece of fiction. If you've read Jeffrey Eugenides' Middlesex, there is a part in there, you know, where they talk about what's happening in that place. And so, you know, definitely different writers have picked this up and used it in their work to sort of center people in time. But, you know, it's really interesting. So this is the only thing I can compare it to. So in 2008, Iowa City flooded, you know, along with other parts of Iowa, and we flooded terribly right along the river, and our campus is situated along the river, so it felt like the center of my life. You know, the building I was teaching in was completely flooded. I didn't have an office. I lost everything. It was really a traumatic event. But what was really interesting is life went on. There were a number of people in Iowa City who were just doing their thing, that weren't really affected by the flood at all, hadn't gone to see it up close, you know, really stayed away, knew that it was happening, but somehow sort of disconnected from that. And the same thing happened in Detroit. You know, you have all of this violence. You have people being shot, being hurt, cars being set on fire, people being pulled off of streetcars. And, you know, still in Detroit, life is going on. You know, people are answering the telephone, they're going to work, there's kids going to school, you know, a lot of daily life is going on. So I really struggled with that, though. And I did think about, you know, I did sort of try to have some characters in there. So, and they just play a small role in these stories. And really what I'm hoping people will do is get fascinated by them and go deeper and look them up and find out more about them. They each, you know, each person that I sort of highlight played a role in that history. That's a great question, though. And Firekeepers Daughter, amazing, you know, piece of art.
Yeah, one of my other favorites is Ossian Sweet.
Oh, yes. So it's so funny because I drew a whole chapter around, you know, what happened, you know, with his house, and that in and of itself would make a phenomenal graphic novel. What a story, you know. And the thing about it is, it's just filled with tragedy, what happened to Sweet. And so, you know, in the end, I ended up cutting it because you know, it was one of those rabbit holes. I was like, well, I'm just not sure how far down and how far back I need to go to explain, you know, what had happened. And at some point I had to say, okay, I'm going to stop really in the 30s. But yeah, the story of Sweet is phenomenal. And I do try to mention it just to kind of get people to think, what is that? I don't know what that is. I'm going to look it up.
We have a question. Was there an incident that sparked the rebellion?
You know, Susan, I think that's a great question. And one of the things, you know, another thing I did, when I first did this, I just drew, you know, the days in June when the rebellion was happening. I started at Belle Isle and then worked my way across the city to these different sites. But it didn't make sense because that question, what happened, how did this happen, was really at the heart. You know, afterwards people were like, what happened? But there really was a series of incidents and issues that really built up to this thing, and no one really knows exactly the moment that sparked this. It did start on Belle Isle. There is speculation that there were young men playing craps and that got out of hand, and then the young men involved in that small scuffle sort of went on to create bigger scuffles across the island, and then people just kind of got swept up in it. And there was one bridge going on and off the island, and so, you know, a scuffle happens on that, and more people join. That photograph in my presentation, we didn't get to see it, but you begin to see people sort of moving in this groupthink mentality, saying something's happening, I'm going to pile on, I'm going to get involved. And, you know, someone gets pushed and then they push back, and before you know it, you know, you're in the middle of something that you really hadn't planned on. So another question, the story of Mary Turner and how her story impacted the writing of Run Home. So The Mary Turner story and actually the connection is not only the rumor that a Black woman and her child are killed, but also Walter White and the NAACP. So Walter White, was fresh out of college at this point, and Mary Turner happens in 1918. So again, World War I is happening. And there's a lot of things that happened during World War I as well, besides World War I. So, the Spanish flu happens. Mary Turner's story takes place in Georgia. Georgia has just been hit by the boll weevils. So their cotton crop is obviously in jeopardy. So in South Georgia, which was only about an hour and a half from where I went to, oh, hi, Christine. She's here. I owe you a box of books. Anyway, so in Georgia in 1918, in southern Georgia, there's a small town, Valdosta, Georgia. And Valdosta State University, great school, is there. There is an incident with a white farmer who has a terrible reputation in the Black community as a very brutal man. He basically can't get anyone to work on his farm, so he has a deal with it's sort of like the debtor's prison. So, Black men are picked up for ridiculous and minor, offenses. They are put in jail. Their, bail is set at this high number. They can't get out. So basically white landowners post their bail, and they have to work their bail off through labor. And, the terms of that are ambiguous oftentimes. So they really are part of this terrible system. And so he was one of the people participating in this system. He is shot through the window of his house. His pregnant wife is there. She is shot through the shoulder. The story goes the bullet went through her and lodged in his heart and killed him. And this is a very prominent white couple. He has brothers. They find out this has happened. They start, basically, they assemble a posse of white men, and they begin to indiscriminately kill and lynch Black men who, might have a loose affiliation with Hampton Smith, who shot her, might not. And so over the course of a very short amount of time, about approximately 11 people are killed. And there's some discrepancy in terms of, there's also some bodies found at this point in time that they think are part of this lynching spree, but it's not, no one knows for sure. So Mary Turner, her husband Hayes Turner, is lynched, and she is 8 months. Well, she's 8 months pregnant at the time. She becomes enraged. She speaks up and says, if I knew the names of these men, I would have warrants sworn for their arrest. They come the next day and they take her. They drive her past her husband's body, and she is killed. And her baby is also taken from her body and killed as well in a very brutal way. And so that story, at the time I was practicing as a doula, and that story really stuck in my head. And it was stuck in my head as a series of images that were going to be, I was originally going to do them as wood cuts, but I ended up doing them as linoleum cuts. And I also saw an exhibition in Washington, D.C. at the Women's Museum of an artist who did wordless graphic novels, and they were all done in woodcut. So, but Walter White goes down to Valdosta shortly after this has happened. No justice is done for these people. And he passes for a white man. He has blonde hair and blue eyes, and he comes into town, into Valdosta, as a traveling salesman, and, sits in cafes, goes to barber shops, basically gets the story, and finds this man who participated and was there, who tells him everything and says, listen, I'll tell you what happened, but you've got to make sure that, I'm not mentioned in any way. And so Walter White writes this account up, sends it to authorities. No one cares. No one listens. The governor says, yeah, that was really bad. If Black communities would do better, we wouldn't have this vigilante kind of justice on our hands. So that's in the South, that's the reaction, whereas in other parts of the country, people are absolutely horrified and nothing is ever done. There is no justice for the people who were lynched in that. So, and it's a very similar, in that I used historical documents. The Mary Turner Project actually has this beautiful archive of all of these things attached to that story. And Julie Armstrong, who wrote a piece for that book is sort of the prominent historian, and she has done a great deal of work about that story, and then art that was inspired by that story. Great question. So I got one more question. In France during World War II, Black Americans were appreciated by the French. Coming home to the US was not the same. Josephine Baker, great example, singer and dancer, loved by the French, not so much by America. She eventually moved to France. Yes, absolutely. So, you know, and the other story is, if you think about Billie Holiday, that's another story that I think about, you know, along with Josephine Baker, in a way where, you know, here's this amazing artist. She's a Black woman. She's never going to be recognized fully as, you know, as someone who deserves the same rights and privileges as everyone else. And that was true during World War II. There's a number of things about that in the book. Other questions?
There's one else. How did you decide what to include and what to cut out to tell your story?
I really struggled with it. And it got to be, you know, this is another reason it took me so long. And I did cut a lot out, and really, it really became about how to make it cohesive and also make it something that people who liked history but weren't like history geeks would be able to enjoy. You know, I can get really bogged down in details and minutia, and I think that takes away from the bigger, you know, bigger picture and the bigger theme. So really, I had to think about, you know, what are the big themes here and what stories really play to those themes.
I'm smiling a bit because I was just thinking there's a wonderful illustration of a car on the screen, and yet you're telling us you're not good at drawing cars.
Terrible. I struggle drawing cars. I wish I could. I really wish I could.
What related, I think related a little bit to that is, of course, it's always hard for any author or artist, I'm sure, although I'm art ungifted, to actually, or undisciplined, I think is probably more accurate, to tell another community's story. And I'm sure that must have been quite a struggle for you as you waded into this topic.
Absolutely.
What were some of the sort of hardest points of dealing with that as you finished up the book?
Well, you know, I really, I am not from Detroit. I am not, you know, obviously from Michigan at all, but I really fell in love with that city. And I did think, you know, historians talk about things that are, you know, people that are not alive any longer that they never rubbed shoulders with. They talk about places that they, you know, are not part of that community. And I really did struggle. And I don't think, you know, I think of this as a story of, you know, where there's a lot of white supremacy throughout the entire book. And I think those stories need to be uncovered. They need to be told. You know, we really need to talk about how during World War II, yes, there was this beautiful moment when the United States pulled together and really did everything they could to sort of, you know, establish this sense of human dignity and human justice and right. But at the same time, you know, indigenous people in our country, obviously, the Latinx community, you know, you have Asian communities that had struggled, and the Black community had all struggled for years with, you know, what does it mean to be a fully recognized citizen? So I really felt like, you know, those are important stories. And as an artist, I felt like all stories are available for everyone to tell. And so if I only told stories that were about, you know, white women in North Carolina, that would be a very, you know, narrow pool. I will say the latest piece that I'm working on, the latest book I'm working on, is about a young 14-year-old Black young man who was enslaved. And at the end, almost at the end of the Civil War, he escapes through the Dismal Swamp to the Union in Virginia. And all of this happened probably about 45 minutes from where I grew up. And I'm very, very familiar with all the places he talks about. And I've spent a lot of time in the Dismal Swamp. And so that story really appealed to me because it was so much a part of my own experience. But yeah, you know, I did feel like I really want to try to get this right. One, because I do love Detroit now, and I did feel a real sense of obligation to that city and to history as a whole. But I also think that this is a story, you know, that really echoes themes that are broadly relevant even now in our country, you know, where there is still a lot of inequity and injustice. It's a great question.
One of the, and this, of course, I'm not from here, and I've only been in this job for 3 years and a couple of months. Everything I know about Detroit, I learned from your book, which is actually kind of true, because one of the things I did was I read Run Home, and then I went to the Detroit Historical Museum, which is a wonderful museum.
Yes.
There's not actually a lot about 1943 in there, because 1943 is a little bit forgotten. There's a few things, but it really helped contextualize that. And then, of course, we ran over to the Henry Ford Museum, which tells American history in its own very unique way.
Right.
And it pulled everything together in a really interesting way in my head. But because I started with Run Home, which is so Detroit centric and so place centric because of the way you did it. In so many ways, it's a book about place. You know, my sense of Detroit and Detroit history is now permanently shaped by your sense of that. So there you go. But Susan asks also, where does the title come from?
This is actually a great question, and something I'm still scratching my head about, if I'm really brutally honest. You know, you saw my notebooks, where I just keep random scraps of, you know, oh, I ran across this information. I think I'll just jot this down. For the life of me, this was in a retelling of what happened during the uprising. There was a story somewhere in some book, in some place, where two people are having a conversation and one says, you know, there's a riot going on, run home if you don't want to be killed. And that idea really stuck in my head. You know, this idea of like, there's a story in there about a soldier who, you know, gets dressed up to go see a movie, and he gets, you know, beaten by this policeman on the back of the head. And he, you know, again, is one of these people, he has no idea. There's another person who, Samuel Mitchell gets ready to go to work. He, you know, he puts his clothes on, goes to the streetcar like he does every day. He works at a bank. You know, as he gets closer to where all of the violence is happening, he realizes, wow, this was a really bad idea. Things are just terrible. I wish I could leave. And so this phrase, run home if you don't want to be killed, really echoed in my head. But I have ripped my archives apart trying to figure out where this sentence came from. And I'll be damned, I have looked seriously for probably the past 7 years, and I cannot figure out where that sentence came from in all of my research, you know, wanderings. So I always think about, I do history kind of like a housefly, you know, inside of a hot window. So I'm not particularly systematic about things. I kind of bounce around and land on things.
I believe it's a quote, because I always get the title wrong because it seems a little bit off.
Yeah.
Contemporary idiom, and I now just call the book Run Home, because when I tell people about it, in fact, I told a student the wrong title today. I said, you gotta, because she's from Detroit and into history, I said, you gotta read this book, Run Home if you don't want to die. No, run home if you don't want to be killed. Yeah, I think that sounds perfectly accurate. New question. What would you say to those who disparage the substance and importance of critical race theory and pedagogy?
You know, this is such an interesting issue, and really it's become a dog whistle. I'll be really honest. If people would read critical race theory, they would realize that these are scholars thinking about the ways that the laws in our country have evolved, been designed in particular moments to exclude people and to continuously oppress people. I used to be a high school teacher. I've also worked with elementary school kids and educated K through 12 teachers. There are not elementary teachers teaching critical race theory. I guarantee you. Critical race theory is something my undergraduates read occasionally. My graduate students definitely read. But I do think anyone who looks at history and looks at history closely in our country and looks at how, you know, laws have been made around issues of citizenship, around, you know, full inclusion, there's no way they could deny that there isn't, you know, that there hasn't been a system of and a pattern of continued injustice, you know, and the fact that theoretically things have been sorted by the courts, which we know this is not true. You know, that's why the court continues to exist, to figure out, you know, how to think about the law. There is still injustice in our country. So I actually think it's quite important to think about race and race theory and how that maps onto people's experience in the United States. So, okay, I can take about one more question and then my voice is going to disappear. I've been teaching and working all day.
You've been very generous with your time. So we have one more question out there. Okay, here it is. Do you think that the better treatment of the French towards Black Americans during World War II led to the demonstrations of 43-44?
I'm sure that played a role in it. I know that Black soldiers were able to see that there are, you know, places that are predominantly white that would not see Black people as inferior. However, you know, if you think about the history of colonialism, it's not that simple. But I would say that there have been racial uprisings and urban rebellions centered on race and inequality for, you know, long before 1943. I mean, these also happened during World War I and even before that. You know, I think about the Chinese massacre in 1871 in Los Angeles. I mean, there's a lot of there's a long history of urban rebellions. And so what happened in 1943 is not significant in that way. It's significant in that it was the largest one that particular year. But what I find to be significant about it is that a number of the people who were involved and who show up in that history become very big voices in the civil rights movement. So in my mind, that's really the early, you know, when we think of the modern civil rights movement, that's really one of the key starting places and starting points is World War II.
So that's a great, we must have someone in our audience who is studying that issue. So yes. I look forward to hearing them give a presentation at the Clarke Historical Library in a couple of years. Maybe they're going to have a graphic novel. That would be awesome too. I'm not sure who it is, so you will never know. So I'm going to, we'll end it there. I want to thank the audience, of course, for joining us, because nothing happens without an audience in these sorts of presentations. The Clarke Historical Library and the board of the Clarke Historical Library for organizing this and putting it together. And last but certainly not least, Rachel Williams for being very generous with her time. Both the 12 years for putting together Run Home, and I don't know how many years of, I don't know where you find the time to do all of the many things you've done in your life. I'm popping your website into the comments for people to click very quickly before we sign off, so you can see beautiful artwork and a variety of other things. And with that, we will call it an evening. I always think it's very odd how these things just end with dead space. So I'm going to applaud.
Thank you. Thank you all for being such a good audience and for asking such good questions. So go to the source, buy the book. Have a great night. Thank you, Dean Rothis, and thank you to the staff at the Clarke Historical Society, and especially Brian Whitledge for helping me sort all this out. So
Thank you,
y'all
Brian.
have a wonderful night. Thank you, thank you, thank you. It's been an honor.